Just a quick warning, this episode contains some strong language, so be advised, shit's about to get real. Hey, it's Chris again, and the voice you're about to hear belongs to my ShoHawk co-founder, Mike Hall.
When you have a really complicated story, the more people you need involved to actually create that story.
That story Mike's referring to is our first feature film, The Painted City, which we produced almost a decade ago. We had a budget of about $5,000 and a really good script, but it was way too ambitious. Plain and simple. The budget didn't fit the material.
If you have multiple locations, multiple cast members, a bunch of wardrobe, Chris and I were doing everything ourselves. And so when you have a really complex story, you need to start adding crew members to help you organize everything. If we had focused on having a really simple storyline, we would have had such a better outcome than the actual final product. I remember in the initial script we had, I don't know how many locations. We had a ton of locations. We had a car chase. We had all these action scenes. And we kept all of that stuff in the script. But as we started filming and throughout the filming process, we actually started cutting those scenes. We cut the car chase. We cut all these big action sequences because we very quickly realized we can't pull all of this stuff off, just the two of us. And if we had, from the very get-go, if we had focused on a story that was very simple, or if we had even simplified The Painted City, we would have had a really great film.
And we learned that the hard way, well after the movie was done and had premiered. We also learned it on investors' money, which made it that much harder. But we did learn. I've gone on to make more work in the field. Mike is a really accomplished producer on everything from commercials for huge companies to feature films and TV shows. His first industry gig after being a PA was as a production accountant on a feature film. So money in movies, it's kind of his thing. In episode 1, we talked about writing the perfect micro-budget script and the things you should be thinking about when reverse engineering your film for production success. And crafting your budget, it's the next chance to review all these items. It's your next pass at preparing for successful filmmaking. Things like refining the amount of locations, cast, crew, props, all of it. And Mike did a good job of summing up the importance of this process, especially for first-time filmmakers. If that's you, hopefully you get this message without making our mistakes. So, why is careful budgeting and film structuring so important?
Because when you're a first-time filmmaker, you should really be focusing on the story. What's going to move people? What's going to contribute to the film itself? There's so many filmmakers in our generation that focus so much on gear and the coolest new gadgets and whatever. But guess what? Most people going to a film or going to see your project don't really care about that stuff. They care about the overall story.
And that's just the God's honest truth. You can worry up and down about what camera or what VFX plugins you use, but none of it matters worth a shit if your audience isn't engaged. In this episode, we're going to talk about budgets. The important things to keep in mind while budgeting your film and the process of budgeting a micro-budget movie. We'll talk about common mistakes I've made in the past, mistakes I made on Counterintelligence, and by the end of the episode, with some additional tools that we'll provide, you should be ready to budget your micro-budget feature in detail. So whether you're self-financing, like I did, crowdfunding, or raising investment capital, you'll be prepared to account for the dollars and cents. Because if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense, know what I mean? So, let's budget this movie.
An expression. A free film. For no money, for no anything. Half of the battle to make it a good film in the United States. A free film, I say good film, it's a free film. Whether it's good or bad, we don't know. But we'll put a year in for no money, for no anything. Simply because there's an expression that has to be said. Now, we don't have any reverence for this expression. We don't believe it's a church. We have to have a good time, otherwise we die. I mean, how much does this cost, paper, to do the hard work, and how much does reels cost? We get it all from the major studios. They help us destroy them. That's the way we work. Because if we make a good film, they will only suffer. And as they suffer, they come and they say, please make films for us, and we say, no, we don't want to make films for you. Hip, hip, hooray.
Remember the storm? We're making our film, building a boat in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of a storm. Well, if the script is the blueprint, the budget is where you start figuring out how long you have to gather tools and supplies before that massive interstellar-style wave comes smashing down. How do you know how much your film should cost? Well, there's a lot to assume. But as the Steven Seagal classic Under Siege 2, Dark Territory reminds us,
The bond, I assumed he was dead. Assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups.
According to Mike, though,
so many filmmakers and producers focus on the shoot production that they don't leave enough wiggle room for post-production. And I've seen this at every level of every budget that I've ever worked at.
this was true of Painted City, it was true of my documentary, Light, and it was true of Counterintelligence to a great extent.
Most films, all films, really come together in post-production. And not enough people leave themselves runway at the end of the production to actually make the film the best that it can be, because they run out of money before they are actually able to bring the project together.
This is such an astute observation, I opted to put it near the front of the episode, just to make it clear, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of budgeting production, that this is invaluable information, especially on a tiny budget with very few collaborators. So,
give yourself enough money for pre-production, so enough money to pay yourself, your PAs, your casting.
Sorry, just gonna cut in here. Pre-production costs are highly flexible on a micro budget. You more than likely won't have PAs, and many of your early collaborators may be partners who are sacrificing upfront pay for back-end profits. So don't get intimidated out of the gate. The important thing?
And then look at it for shoot production, and then look at it for post-production. That way you're taking all factors into consideration when looking at the budget. And quite frankly, when you're looking at post-production, you shouldn't just be looking at post-production. You should be looking at advertising. You should be looking at film festivals. You should be looking at travel. You should be looking at PR. So whatever you have in mind for post-production, you should double it.
Double it. Even if you're 100% plus positive certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that those doing your post will be working completely for free up front, you should calculate the overall costs and tally up things like advertising, festival submissions, and what it'll take to push your movie out into the world, because if it doesn't get out into the world, you've just spent a lot of money on something just for yourself. That's fine if you have the money to burn, or if you have so little moral foundation that you're okay blowing other people's money so irresponsibly. Otherwise, post and what comes after are imperative to budget for early on. But you may be thinking, well, shit, Chris and Mike, how much does all that cost?
So what I would do is sit down with a experienced post-production supervisor or producer, figure out what you need to lock your picture. So look at coloring, look at sound, look at music. Take that number that you settle on and then double it. That way you have enough runway and safety net so that if you do go over in post-production on sound or coloring, that way you have a little bit of wiggle room. And then you'll also have enough money for everything that I just spoke about in terms of promoting your film as well.
Got it? Good. If you don't, we'll get even more into it later in the episode. Now, Let's step back to the beginning of budgeting. You probably have some idea why budgets are so important, but the temptation is always there to wing it, especially if costs are low. Maybe not even wing it entirely, but just play a little fast and loose with what little cash you have. Be flexible. But let me tell you, detailed budgets serve a lot more purpose than just simply creating a plan or showing investors where their money's going and that you're a responsible adult.
It forces you to analyze every aspect of the project. If you're taking a budget and you look at a script scene by scene, and then you transfer everything that you see into a scene. So you look at characters, you look at props, you look at wardrobe, you look at locations, you look at everything scene by scene. It really makes you, as a first-time filmmaker, analyze what is really, really important.
Now, if you're following along, a lot of this was done while reverse engineering your script, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't change some things or make some adjustments when budgeting came around. In many ways, doing the research to craft an accurate budget up front really takes away a lot of the surprises and makes your production that much more prepared. I like to think of the budget and script as married. They're unique documents that build off one another to form a full picture. Budgets give you the opportunity to think about every single what if. What will each day look like? What could go wrong? What's required to ensure as little goes wrong as possible? Because how you see the world you're creating dictates how much it'll cost to build and sustain.
Look at wardrobe, look at locations, look at if you can use natural light, if you have to use a lighting setup. I would really ask yourself, is it important to the story that it takes place in this location? Because locations is where you can really save a lot of money for a first-time film.
And by that, Mike doesn't just mean the cost of the location itself. He also means things like whether the location has adequate natural light or whether it's under a freeway overpass that requires insane sound trickery. Everything on a shoot costs something. At the very least, problems cost extra time, which is far from cheap. You may even want to take the budgeting opportunity to think of some backups. In the case of Counterintelligence, there was a location I wrote a key sequence for, a place I've always wanted to shoot. My DP, Mike Elliott, and I even took a camera there to shoot tests and block the scene at one point, only to later find out it would cost half our budget to shoot there and double our insurance costs. Then we had to scramble for a replacement. So using the budgeting period to hyper-analyze outcomes is really important. We're also using locations as an analogy for the greater questions you should be provoked to ask.
Think about yourself as an audience member. Like, what are the big takeaways from this film? Like, do you, as an audience member, do you really care if the story takes place in a mansion, or can the story get away with the script taking place in an apartment, for example? Like, where can you trim stuff, and what really matters in the end?
Ask yourself throughout budgeting, what matters for the audience, and are there any extraneous things I can remove, merge, or adjust that won't affect audience experience but will bring down the cost? This should be especially mission critical if your deeper analysis of locations, characters, crew, props, and gear is revealing that your costs may be a little higher than what you planned or could possibly raise funding for. A huge part of raising money is being realistic with your budget and knowing what the bare minimum costs could be without sacrificing the final film's quality. How small can you go within the realm of reasonability? But, and not to overcomplicate matters, it's a fine balance. You don't necessarily want to go too sparse. You should be looking at examples and doing some research to hit that happy medium.
If you're creating a budget for the first time, what I would do is just go to Google and find example budgets of feature films, or if you're working on a short film, whatever is in your budget range. Look at those as examples as how much someone is putting towards that line item. And then I honestly would multiply that by 20% just so you have a little buffer. And that's the biggest problem I see with most filmmakers is that they've budgeted so bare bones that they get halfway through the project and then they don't have any money left over. And then the story suffers because they don't have a little extra cash reserve.
Part of the reason budgeting can be so intimidating is that you may feel like you're constantly sliding along a razor's edge between too much and too little, which you kind of are. But hopefully, this can actually be sort of a fun challenge, another important and engaging part of the creative filmmaking process. It can be one of the most gratifying Rubik's Cubes you'll confront while making your micro-budget movie. Many listeners, I guarantee, as stubborn artists, will probably still say whatever to a lot of these tips we've laid out. Do so at your own risk. Now, with those fundamentals laid out, let's start sifting through how I budgeted Counterintelligence. It may get a little inside baseball for some people, but if that's you, it probably means you'll want to listen even closer. And to help you along with the episode, and more importantly, your own micro-budget feature, I want you to check out ShoHawk.com/makethismovie. I plugged it last time, but this time it's even more important because now, when you sign up for free, you'll get templates of all the budgeting forms I cover in this episode. You can use them to follow along with my descriptions and even feel free to use them on your own film. They're customized for super small budgets and really simple to fill in because I'm at about a third grade level of spreadsheet creation. So anybody can implement them into their production, even if you've never budgeted a single thing before. Again, if you're not driving or working out right now, visit ShoHawk.com/makethismovie, sign up, and get the forms for free, along with a ton of other tools and info relevant to this series that will keep evolving as the series goes on. One more time, ShoHawk.com/makethismovie, free of charge, free 99. And if you can't get to it now, you can keep listening and re-listen after you've signed up. So here we go. Before I even started on the spreadsheets, I broke down the script. Script breakdowns are essential because they organize your screenplay into producible chunks and itemize each and every fragment so nothing gets forgotten and everything is planned for. Typically, this job is done by a producer or line producer. If you're producing yourself and your film is simple enough, you can absolutely do it on your own in very little time. I wrote the Counterintelligence script in Final Draft, which is kind of an industry standard, but there's a ton of other script writing software, some of which is free, like Keltex. And in those programs, as far as I know, a lot of times you have to do the script breakdown manually. Final Draft has features that kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. The first step to breaking down a script is breaking down each page into eighths. I don't know why that is, but that's kind of the industry standard. A scene might be 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 7/8 of a page. And what you want to do when you break down your script is go scene by scene, noting how long each scene is in eighths of a page. And you basically want to turn that into a list. Then you want to take that list, which is probably out of location order, and you want to put it in order of location and batch the locations together. So everything that takes place at my apartment in Counterintelligence, I put that in one big group, all the apartment stuff. And everything that takes place in an office, I take all those scenes and group them. So now you have a macro view of every scene by location and how long each one is. In addition to this, you also want to note every character that's in each scene. So now you're looking at your script breakdown sheet. It's got all of your scenes bundled together by location with each of their lengths and who's in them. This is where your first spreadsheet enters the equation. I created a spreadsheet called Schedule 1, which is also available on the website. Schedule 1 has 8 columns. The first is Scene, which is where you put the scene headings that you collected in your breakdown. The second is Scene Number, which notes the number of each scene in your formatted script. The third is Pages, which shows how many pages each scene is, 1/8, 1 3/8, 2/8. The fourth is Page Number, which page number that scene starts on. The fifth is Locations. So for that, if I could, I would put down the address of each location that scene is being shot at. The next column is Characters. In that, I note every character that's going to be at that location shooting those scenes. The next is Props, In that, I note every single prop that's going to be necessary to shoot all of the scenes that take place at that location. And then the final column is costumes. This is where you put down, obviously, every costume that a character is going to need at that location. And that's it. That's schedule 1. So I do this for every single location. And what you start to get are big and little blocks that you can begin to put into actual days, shoot days. You can get an idea for how long it'll take to shoot each scene at each location, factoring in things like travel between locations, and basically start segmenting out a shooting schedule, hence Schedule 1. What I like to do is at the bottom of each block, as in each location block, I add up all the pages we need to shoot, things like costume changes, things like time changes, etc. And then I like to project how many hours it'll take to shoot each block. That gives you an even better idea of where each shooting block fits in each shooting day. Interestingly, our projected hours never change that much after my initial breakdown in Schedule 1. If you're experienced and know your own abilities and those of at least one of your key collaborators, Mike Elliott, my DP in this case, you can project fairly accurately how long things will take. So that's the Schedule 1. We've gone from script breakdown to breaking things out in terms of time, characters, props, all the necessary things for a shoot day. What I do from that is I turn that time breakdown into a cast and crew list per day. Then I add food, gear, etc. And you start to get an even clearer picture of what the costs of each day will be. Then you get to the actual budget. For this, I created another spreadsheet called Counterintelligence Budget Breakdown. This became the evolving form that was consistently used as my budget all the way through production and even post. The Counterintelligence Budget Breakdown contains 8 modules or blocks. They account for props, cast, crew, costumes, additional costs, equipment, and overview. So we're stepping away from the schedule now, and we're just looking at totals for each block. Each block contains the item, the cost, in terms of props, whether it's returnable or not, the purchase status, and return status, or it'll just contain columns like unit, amount, unit cost, and then the total cost of the units added up over the entire course of production. So let's get to actually using this form for budgeting, and we'll take each block in order. First, props. You take every prop that you've added up throughout your script and you list them in this block on budget breakdown. To do actual prop cost research, I like to just go to Amazon. For the entirety of Counterintelligence, it took about 20 minutes to figure out what each prop would cost, and therefore how much my total prop budget would be. Also noting whether those props are returnable or not, because if they are, you can get your money back on those props. And that's pretty simple. You add up the totals at the bottom of the props module. The next module is cast. What I did for this was I listed my cast, and then for the unit price, I used the SAG minimum day rate for ultra low budget, which is $125 a day at the time of this recording and at the time of production. So I put down each cast member at $125 a day, and then I added up what their total cost would be for the entirety of the shoot. Next module, crew. You do the same thing. You list each crew member, add up the number of days that they're going to be there, put what their day rate is. For this, you might have to ask around sometimes, but you put down each of their day rates and add up the total cost for the time that you'll need them. Costumes works a lot like props. You can look on Amazon, you can look at other websites. In this case, I enlisted the help of Andrea Tolbert, who is our art director, who went through, did some research on how much each costume was going to cost that we'd need. I plug in those values, total them up, and note whether they're returnable or not. Next are additional costs. Additional costs account, at least in my budget, for things like production insurance, the cost of incorporating into a company, which I did, which we'll talk about in the next episode, the cost of paying a payroll company, craft services, so food, and location fees. You put in each of those items, the amount, the unit cost, and then you total that up. The next module is equipment. This covers rental equipment, things you might need to purchase to round out your equipment stash, etc. Talk to your DP and sound department well in advance, and they'll give you a list of things that they'll need to properly execute the shoot. You can negotiate some of these things back and forth with them, and in some cases, one or both of your departments might have their own gear, but they'll charge you a rental cost for using it, so you want to factor that in as well. As far as rental fees, most rental houses have online rate sheets where you can go and total up the cost of things that you'll need for production, how much it'll be to rent them, and add that to your budget. And a pro tip note here, most rental houses have something called weekend pricing, which basically means you can rent on a Friday and pay only a single day rate for each thing you rent, but for the entire weekend, and return everything on Monday. So if you're renting something that costs $125, you get it for $125 for 3 days. It's a pretty awesome thing, and a lot of rental houses do it. At this point, too, I want to give a shout out to Tamara at ProPhoto. She hooked us up with a ton of deals. ProPhoto in Portland is amazing. We've had a relationship with them for a really long time, and if you live here, I highly recommend renting from them. Tamara, thank you. You're amazing. And that's the equipment module. The other stuff that you'll want to disperse throughout this sheet where you see fit are the costs of post. Now, Mike Elliott and I did most of post, so I didn't include a lot of this in the actual budget. But here you'll want to include things like the cost of an editor, the cost of a sound mixer, the cost of a colorist if you go that route and you're not doing it yourself, or your DP's not doing it themselves. Here you'll also want to add the stuff that Mike talked about, an average cost of submitting to a few festivals. Maybe use 10 festivals as your benchmark. You'll want to also add the cost to get the film up on platforms like iTunes, Amazon, things like that. What do those services cost? This can be dispersed across any number of modules on the form, so I'll leave it up to you. But it is really important to include this stuff. And then you'll want to add the cushion. Typically, I like to put that on the additional costs module, which, as Mike recommended, would be the cost of post doubled. And then the final module is the overview. So you'll want to plug in the full final costs of each module. And this is just a quick place to look to see the added up full budget and the cost of each module. And every time you make adjustments to each module, adjust the price in the overview, and you'll get a quick look at what your total budget is at that point. And that's it. From script breakdown to budget breakdown. Over the course of production, your budget can take on a life of its own. It's your responsibility to rein it in and keep it in check. And as Mike said, you're going to want to double the post budget for some cushion and additional fees you may face down the line, if at all possible. There definitely needs to be some significant cushion allotment. Here's the thing. My early budget, the one I really started grinding with, it was missing a little over $3,800. That's $3,800 missing. Give or take a couple bucks, but either way, on an $11,000 movie, that's not chump change. Yeah, I initially thought the movie would cost $7,000 because, Robert Rodriguez. So, where did that $3,800 go? What didn't I think of? Let's chase the missing money. I want to be super clear, though. Every dollar spent was a conscious decision, and every one of those decisions was made through the filter of paying more to save time or increase quality. And none of them were made fleetingly. I did factor in a cushion. The budget was still so low that I had to take quality wherever I could get it. There's a huge difference between making a movie for $11,000 and making a movie that looks like it was made for $11,000. So, with that in mind, what did I initially miss? Here we go. First of all, I didn't initially plan on hiring a casting director, which came at a cost, of course. The good news for you, dear listener, is in a couple episodes, I'm going to dedicate an entire episode to that process, where you'll hear from Counterintelligence's casting director, Rachel Meyer, and we suss out the details. Basically, though, it came down to my time. Casting would have been a massive time suck. All the emailing, outreach, and not to mention, I didn't even know where to start. That said, our 150% worth it casting director, Rachel Meyer, made up almost 10% of the budget. So, there's that. But what about the other dollars and cents? Well, I didn't plan on becoming a SAG-AFTRA production, Screen Actors Guild. In fact, I planned against it based on Mike's and my experience in the past with Painted City.
Neither of us had done a ton of research into what it would take to get a SAG member into the film. We should have focused a little more on doing our research around the ultra low budget agreement for the Screen Actors Guild. And so if you're a first-time filmmaker, I would take the time to actually research a little bit into how to get these actors from a low budget agreement. And you don't have to do everything yourself. You can hire a casting agent or hire someone with that expertise to actually do that stuff for you. And I would highly encourage it because the performances you'll get, the on-screen presence you'll get is so much greater, and you'll have so many more opportunities to actually get that into your film if you explore having a low-budget agreement.
After Rachel convinced me that SAG was a totally good idea, which it was, and that she knew someone who could help me with the paperwork at low cost, I learned what else comes along with becoming a SAG production. You have to hire a payroll service, and you're required to have production insurance, and those are added costs. If you're not super familiar with payroll or insurance, here's a quick synopsis. Production insurance is a temporary insurance coverage that protects your production from things like on-the-job liability, cast and crew injury, location damage, and so on. A payroll company is a service that a business can sign up with, and they handle printing and sending checks to whoever your company, in this case your production, employs and identifies as needing a paycheck. For insurance, I ended up going with Film Emporium, which ran us $481 after a bit of back and forth to find the right plan. Their service and support were awesome, though. For a payroll service, we went with Paychecks, which came recommended by our associate producer, Chelsea, who was handling SAG stuff. They were the most affordable option at $240, and the service was also great, especially for as little as we utilized it. I'll dive deeper into both of these in a future episode. So, all in all, the most overlooked costs were casting related, and that's for you to know and me to remember. I also didn't take a fast enough leap into asking around for crew rates. Early on, I made some assumptions that ended up adding a little extra to the overall cost of making Counterintelligence, particularly with reference to audio recordist rates. And you remember what wiser people have said about assumptions.
Assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups.
It's important to do your research early on, reaching out to other filmmakers in your community who may have answers to financial questions you don't. I ended up going through Rachel Meyer for a sound department reference and landed on Tim Kahn. More on that in a few episodes too. But his rate turned out to be a little higher than I'd guessed. Totally fair, but a little higher than what I'd assumed.
Assumption is the mother of all...
Yeah, you get it. I just guessed wrong. And lastly, equipment. Early on, I didn't realize the amount of extra gear we'd need to rent or buy. I should have asked for a list from my DP Mike earlier on. These costs weren't huge, but every cent matters on a tight budget. The biggest added equipment cost by far that completely blindsided me, and wouldn't have if I had been a little more attentive early on, hard drives. I bought a lot of them in my life, and I'm pretty used to the world of storage. In 1080p anyway. I know what to expect from basic HD. Counterintelligence, though, was shot in 4K. Here's my DP, Mike Elliott.
We shot in 4K. We didn't really need to. For a movie like this, some of our shots were just like, the locations were so tight space-wise that I thought having 4K as a means of being able to frame and reframe, because I wasn't able to get the symmetry that I sometimes see. Like, come on, we've all seen The Shining. We have all seen 2001: Space Odyssey. We all know what symmetry is supposed to look like.
Don't get me wrong, the movie looks outstanding. It's crisp, it's beautiful, but let's be real. If you're making a micro-budget feature, your movie's more than likely to see the most play online, not in a theatrical space. And if you look at the movies that Netflix, who require 4K for purchase, are actually buying and making into originals, they're rarely micro-budget features, if ever. That's the reality at this point. That may bother some people to hear, but think of it this way. If you shoot really, really well in 1080p on a nice DSLR or something like a Canon C-Series camera, and you tell a great story and it sounds crisp, most audiences won't know the fucking difference. I feel that warranted profanity just to drive the point home, and I'll repeat, most audiences won't know the fucking difference. But your budget, it will.
It's a delicate sort of fine line, in what you're up against, I think, is deciding whether or not you want to be able to have as much maneuverability in post, or whether or not you want to be able to make sure that you can be on budget with how much footage you'll be collecting, as well as how much your poor computer's going to have to process.
On our little $11,000 movie, $908 were spent on hard drives. How could I have saved more? I could have, at the very least, planned for the correct amount of data usage. Based on shoot dates and number of pages, how many hours of footage will you likely shoot per day? What does that amount to in storage? And so on. You live, you learn. But that was an expensive lesson. Learn from it. Don't make it. And always think long and hard about data while you're building your budget. For every increase, there were areas where I was able to cut corners. Food, costumes, props. They all came in under budget. Mostly because Andrea, my co-producer and art director, was really smart about where we got these things from, how, and in some cases, whether or not we could return certain items and get out without any expense on certain things. There were also substantial savings I arrived at through negotiating back-end percentage points with some key collaborators. More on this and how those contracts work in a later episode as well. Just know that it's possible to do if you're close with those collaborators, there's established trust between you, and most importantly, all parties understand the risks. The reality is, most films make no money. That should be well understood. And for that very reason, Counterintelligence had a very different hue in my brain than other films I've done. My own money stood to disappear forever. In fact, according to statistics, in all likelihood, I'd never see a dime again, and Counterintelligence would disappear into the ether forever or collect dust on a hard drive on my shelf. Not a very inspiring thought while committing my complete savings to this. But, as we discuss next episode, for filmmakers and artists of all kinds, it comes from a deeper place. It comes from a need. You'll hear me talk about preparedness a lot on Make This Movie because preparedness is the number one absolute, paramount, undeniably, inarguably, irrefutably most important asset to a successfully produced micro-budget feature. The amount you and your collaborators are prepared will dictate the mood on set, your mood, and the overall stress level. Believe you me, all of those manifest on screen. A solidly engineered and engaging script is a form of preparedness. A reasonable and thoughtful budget is another. Knowing you're more than likely to lose big than win little is yet another. And preparing your plans to make the best possible outcome more likely at any cost, preparedness. Once I grappled with all this as best I could, which honestly didn't take long, I was ready to fund the movie. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. While you're there, you could totally leave us a rating or a comment or both if you so choose. Those are easy ways to help spread the word to other listeners who like the same stuff as you. Music for the show comes from our film, Counterintelligence, and was composed by the great Noah Simons, who you can find on SoundCloud or Bandcamp as Larians, Larians, and his band, Male Blonding, on Bandcamp, iTunes, and Spotify. They're super good. Make This Movie is brought to you by ShoHawk Media. If you're a filmmaker who wants even more useful info and tools, visit shohawk.com/makethismovie and sign up to access our free micro-budget producer starter kit, including template spreadsheets, documents, and other great stuff we cover throughout this series, ready for you to fill in the blanks. That's shohawk.com/makethismovie. Visit counterflick.com for more information on Counterintelligence, the movie, including fun stuff like our satirical fake news page. Also on Facebook is Counterintelligence, Twitter and Instagram @Counterflick. I'm Chris Socker. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
If it's too much to take on for one person, then build that in for the other human resources that you might need to help you get across that finish line.
That was my biggest mistake.
If you do nothing except make your film, you are a sole proprietor. And when you file your tax return, you will put all the revenue and expenses tied to that film project on a Schedule C. And your revenue minus all your expenses is going to flow to the bottom line, and that's what you're going to get taxed on.